Is this speech about policy or prepping voters for the next political battle?
Remember, we fight for what's right because it's time to go right.
America is talking. The question is, who's really listening? From Washington to Main Street, from federal power to your local community, this is where perspective meets reality. Go right! Stand for liberty tonight! Truth in focus! Voices rise! Freedom lives when people decide. Welcome to Go Right with Peter Boykin, the Constitutionalist for liberty.
Is this speech about policy or prepping voters for the next political battle? Welcome back to Go Right with Peter Boykin, the Constitutionalist for liberty. When we talk about the State of the Union, most people think about applause lines, partisan reactions, and the immediate media spin that follows. But if you step back and look through the lens of a constitutional republic, something deeper is happening. The speech is not about a report card on where America stands. It is an attempt to define where America believes it is going, and more importantly, who gets to decide that direction. This recent State of the Union felt less like a traditional policy briefing and more like a strategic map laid out for a political battlefield that stretches from Washington, D.C. all the way down to local school boards, county commissions, and state legislatures. Every major theme, whether economic nationalism, border security, energy independence, or global strength, was framed not only as a governing agenda, but as a call to voters ahead of ongoing elections. That matters because in our system, speeches do not change the country. Elections do. A president can propose vision, but Congress writes laws. States interpret those laws. Local governments apply them in ways that directly shape everyday life. So when you hear promises about tariffs or domestic manufacturing, that conversation eventually reaches local workers deciding whether factories reopen, small business owners facing supply chain costs, and city councils debating zoning or infrastructure expansion. This is where the gap between national messaging and daily reality becomes visible. Politicians in Washington talk about microeconomic success. Meanwhile, Americans talk about grocery bills, rent payments, insurance costs, and whether their paycheck stretches far enough to cover the month. The speech leaned heavily into a narrative of national strength and recovery, but voters are not just evaluating economic charts, they are measuring their own lived experience. And here's the paradox of modern politics. Both sides claim to speak for ordinary Americans, yet many citizens feel disconnected from both parties. That frustration shows up not only in polling, but in declining trust in institutions and increasing volatility in elections. People are not just choosing between left and right anymore. Many are choosing between engagement and disengagement. The State of the Union attempted to reframe that relationship by presenting a strong executive vision, but the real question is whether voters believe that vision translates into meaningful change at the local level. Because ultimately, federal speeches are symbolic. Local consequences are tangible. When immigration is discussed at the federal level, sheriffs and mayors deal with enforcement realities. When energy policy is debated nationally, local utility rates and infrastructure decisions determine whether families can afford heating and electricity. When economic policies promise growth, state legislators decide tax structures and regulatory fireworks that either encourage or limit that growth. The speech also reflected the increasing shift towards narrative politics, where storytelling becomes as important as policy detail. Emotional framing, patriotic imagery, and strong not just to inform but to mobilize. Supporters hear affirmation of their values. Critics hear confirmation of their fears. And somewhere in the middle sits the independent voter trying to separate rhetoric from reality. That independent voter may be the most important audience right now, because elections are no longer decided purely by party loyalty. They are decided by turnout, enthusiasm, and whether voters feel that anyone is actually addressing their real concern. Rising costs, public safety, education quality, local economic opportunity, and government accountability are issues that cross ideological lines. This is why the State of the Union cannot be viewed in isolation. It is a part of a larger cycle where federal messaging sets the tone, state leaders adapt that tone into legislation, and local candidates turn it into campaign slogans. The speech becomes a blueprint that echoes through campaign ads, town halls, and community debates. And here's something worth thinking about. Every time Americans focus only on presidential politics, they risk overlooking the levels of government that affect them most directly. School boards determine curriculum and policy for children. County commissioners, county officials, city officials manage budgets that impact roads, emergency services, and local taxes. State legislators shape election laws, business regulations, and criminal justice policy. The presidency may be the loudest voice, but local government is often the strongest hand guiding daily life. So what does the State of the Union actually represent? It represents a moment where political leadership attempts to define national identity during a period of uncertainty. It represents an effort to energize supporters while challenging opponents. But above all, it represents a test of whether Americans still believe their participation matters. Because in a constitutional republic, power ultimately flows from the people upwards, not from leadership downwards. The speech sets the stage. The voters write the ending. And that is the real State of the Union. If you believe in liberty, accountability, and a government that serves the people instead of managing them, then the focus cannot stop at listening to speeches. It has to continue with participation, with engagement, and with making sure that from federal offices to local councils, the voices of citizens remain louder than the noise of politics. This is Go Right with Peter Boykin, the Constitutionalist for Liberty. Follow on all the social media platforms, share the conversation, and let others know that the future of our constitutional republic is not decided by speeches alone. It is decided by what we do next. Folks, you can join us on GoRightNews.com, GoRightNC.com, PeterBoykin.com. We have this podcast on Rumble at Go Right News. We have YouTube at Go Right News as well, Go Right Peter Boykin. On other platforms, I just rediscovered BitChute, so I'll be posting there as well. It's on X, it's on X, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Everywhere you can pretty much find us, you're going to find us. Please share, like, and you can also donate at Cash App on the $ GoRightNews.com to help our website continue to grow. God bless everybody.
Rising for new truth, go right!
Remember,
Trump's State of the Union a turning point or just another political speech? Welcome back to Go Right with Peter Boykin, the Constitutionalist for Liberty, where we slow down the noise of the headlines and take a deeper look at what is really happening in our constitutional republic. Tonight we are talking about the State of the Union, not just as a speech delivered from a podium in Washington, but as a moment that reveals where the country believes it stands and where it may be heading next. A quiet moment before a major speech often tells you more than the speech itself. Lawmakers gather, cameras wait, pundits prepare reactions before a single word is spoken. And across America, people either lean forward with hope or lean back with skepticism. That tension is the real state of the union. It is not simply the words spoken inside the chamber, but the expectations carried by millions of Americans watching from living rooms, workplaces, and phones across the country. It reflects a nation wrestling with competing visions of its future. The recent State of the Union delivered by President Donald Trump was not just a policy presentation. It functioned more like a signal flare aimed at the entire political system, from federal power struggles all the way down to local elections shaping everyday communities. In a constitutional republic, speeches like this are less about ceremony and more about direction. The real question is not whether the speech sounded strong or controversial. The real question is how its themes translate into action at every level of government. The address framed America as entering what was described as a renewed era of prosperity, a kind of economic reset built around tariffs, tax policy, and domestic production. The message projected confidence, emphasizing national strength and a return to American manufacturing power. Supporters heard affirmation of a populist economic approach centered on American workers and economic independence. Critics heard political theater, arguing that optimism and national statistics does not always match the reality many Americans feel in their daily lives. And this is where the deeper tension appears. Federal policy narratives often collide with kitchen table economics. Families are not judging economic success by press releases or market reports. They judge it by grocery prices, rent payments, insurance costs, and whether their paycheck still stretches far enough to make it through the month. Inflation concerns, housing affordability, and rising energy bills remain front of mind regardless of political affiliation. From a constitutional perspective, the executive branch proposes direction, but Congress determines whether that direction becomes law. That reality ties every presidential speech directly to elections and legislative battles still to come. As the speech moved into national security themes, immigration enforcement and border security became central pillars, framed as matters of sovereignty and public safety. Foreign policy warnings emphasized global instability and international threats, presenting the world stage as a test of American strength. These issues do more than dominate cable news debates. They activate different voter priorities and ripple into state and local decision-making. Sheriffs, mayors, and community leaders ultimately deal with the real-world outcomes of national policy. Local candidates frequently mirror federal talking points, translating global concerns into neighborhood campaign language that voters encounter closest to home. Shifting from security to economics again, the speech highlighted policy proposals designed to reach beyond Washington. One initiative focused on expanding retirement savings access for Americans without employer plans, a proposal that, if enacted, would ripple through state economies, financial institutions, and workforce planning. Another announcement targeted energy infrastructure costs, suggesting large technology companies operating energy-intensive data centers should carry more of the burden rather than consumers. Even if the practical effects take years to materialize, the messaging speaks directly to voters frustrated by high utility bills and rising living costs. Federal proposals often sound abstract, but they eventually shape municipal budgets, local services, and long-term economic stability within communities. This leads directly into the gap that defines modern politics. National speeches emphasize broad economic indicators, while Americans evaluate reality through personal experience. Rising costs, healthcare expenses, housing pressures, and local taxes define how voters interpret political promises. Elections are often decided in the space between national messaging and lived reality. Federal leaders speak in macroeconomic language, but local voters make decisions based on whether their communities feel safer, more affordable, and more stable. And hovering behind every word of a State of the Union address is the shadow of elections. These speeches are never just summaries of policy. They are campaign roadmaps. The themes emphasized signal priorities to congressional candidates, state legislators, and local officials preparing for upcoming races. Midterm elections determine legislative control, shape taxation and education policies at the state level, and influence local boards responsible for zoning, policing, and public services. A president may set the narrative, but local races ultimately determine whether that narrative becomes reality. What often goes unnoticed is how deeply federal rhetoric influences local governance. National messaging shapes state budget priorities through funding signals. It drives school board debates through cultural narratives. It affects law enforcement priorities and infrastructure planning decisions that directly impact communities. In a constitutional republic, power does not move in only one direction. Federal leadership provides themes, but state and local leaders decide implementation, and citizens ultimately judge the results. Perhaps the most revealing element of this moment is what the speech signals about the future beyond immediate policy debates. Political observers are already looking ahead, evaluating how these themes may shape the next presidential cycle. On the Republican side, future candidates may attempt to carry forward a Trump-style populist message focused on sovereignty and economic nationalism. On the Democratic side, emerging figures may emphasize institutional stability, social policy priorities, or alternative economic frameworks. American elections increasingly revolve around competing narratives about identity and direction, rather than purely technical policy debates. The speech becomes more than a reflection of current leadership. It becomes a preview of ideological battles that could define the 2028 political landscape. All of this raises a fundamental question. Was this State of the Union primarily a governing tool or a campaign stage? The honest answer is that it was both. Presidential messaging must govern, persuade, and mobilize simultaneously. It must reassure supporters, challenge opponents, and test ideas that may define future elections. And that brings us back to the real meaning of the State of the Union. It is not found in applause lines or partisan reactions. It is found in what happens afterward. In a constitutional republic, speeches start conversations, but voters decide outcomes. The presidency sets tone, but local elections set reality. School boards shape education. County officials manage budgets. State legislators write laws that affect daily life far more directly than any single national address. The real question is not whether this speech was historic or political. The real question is whether Americans remain engaged enough to shape what comes next. Because the future of the country is never decided by one speech, one headline, or one election cycle. It is decided by citizens who choose participation over apathy and action over frustration. This is Go Right with Peter Boykin, the Constitutionalist for Liberty. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that the true State of the Union is written not in Washington speeches, but in the choices made by the American people every single day.
every day, everyone shouting, no one prays. They say, pick a side, but I just want peace. Freedom's a fight that never sleeps. Oh, 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 oh.
They call it progress when you can't speak. They call it love, but they crush the weak. I won't hide, won't look away. I'll go right anyway. Oh, oh, oh.
I've got go right running through my veins, fighting fear while they play their games. This world's on fire, but I'll stay free. Can't cancel truth or liberty. Yeah.
They said stay silent, I said no way. They said comply, but I still pray. The flag still waves, the dream's alive. We go right to keep it bright.
No hate can drown this heart of mine. We stand for truth through every line, for every voice they try to hide. We rise, we go right. We've got go right in our souls tonight, rising strong in the blinding light. The storm may rage, but truth won't die. We go right, we reach for the sky.
Fighting, fighting.